She smiled while she handed me the envelope. Inside was a $100,000 fine. For fishing. On my own lake. She wasn't joking. 6 months later, everything I knew about that land changed. What she found in the county archive made her face go white. By the time the truth came out, she wished she'd never touched that fishing rod story. My name is Daniel Reyes, and for 11 years I've lived in Whispering Pines with my wife Sarah and our daughter Emily. I work as a structural engineer. Nothing glamorous, just steady paychecks and weekend cookouts. The one thing that made our house special wasn't the granite counters. It was the lake behind our backyard. The one my grandfather Frank had fished on his whole life. Grandpa Frank bought that land in 1962, long before Whispering Pines existed. When developers came knocking decades later, he sold most of his acreage but kept something quiet in the paperwork, a private easement over the lake itself. He used to tell me, half joking, that no HOA on earth could ever take his water away. I never imagined I'd need those words. Karen Whitfield became HOA president 2 years after we moved in, and the neighborhood changed overnight. Overnight, mailbox colors needed pre-approval. Grass had to be cut to exactly 3 inches. A retired schoolteacher 2 doors down got fined for a garden gnome she'd owned since 1998. Karen called it protecting property values. Everyone else called it something else. Quietly, behind closed doors. At first I stayed out of it. I wasn't on committees. I didn't attend meetings. I just wanted to raise my daughter in peace. Sarah warned me that ignoring Karen never made her go away. She collects grudges like stamps, she said. I laughed it off. Behind our house was about to become Karen's next obsession. Started small, the way these things always do. Karen posted a notice on the community board calling the lake a shared HOA amenity and announcing new usage rules. No fishing without a permit. No permit without board approval. No board approval, apparently, without groveling. I read it twice, confused, because that lake had never once belonged to the HOA. I mentioned it to my neighbor Tom, an old-timer who'd lived there since the original construction. He just shook his head. Years, he said. Says it'll boost home values if she beautifies it into a private clubhouse feature. I didn't think much of it then. I should have. Karen's HOA newsletters became stranger that spring, full of vague language about community assets and shared natural resources requiring management. She never mentioned deeds, surveys, or ownership records. She just repeated the phrase, "The lake belongs to all of us," until people started believing it. The way a lie repeated enough starts sounding like truth. My daughter Emily loved that lake more than anyone. Every Saturday morning, she'd tug my sleeve before sunrise, tackle box already packed. It was our ritual, just the 2 of us. The fog lifting off the water while she cast her line with a technique clumsier than mine ever was. Karen's rules threatened to take that away from us entirely. One afternoon, Karen stopped by uninvited, clipboard in hand, and asked why we were still fishing without registering. I told her plainly that the lake was private property, part of my family's original land grant. She smiled the tight smile of someone who'd already made up her mind. "We'll see about that," she said, and walked off toward her SUV. I didn't think a smile could carry a threat until I saw hers. Sarah noticed it too, watching from the kitchen window. "That woman is planning something," she said. I told her not to worry, that facts were on our side. Looking back, I underestimated how far someone drunk on borrowed authority could actually go. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from the HOA's newly formed Environmental Compliance Committee. It cited alleged violations for unauthorized fishing, unauthorized dock use, and unauthorized ecological disruption to a shared resource. I read the letter 3 times, laughing at the absurdity, right up until I reached the number circled in red at the bottom. $100,000. $100,000. I called the HOA office immediately, my hands actually shaking with disbelief. The woman on the phone transferred me straight to Karen, who answered in that syrupy customer service voice she used whenever she wanted witnesses to think she was being reasonable. "It's all in the bylaws, Daniel," she said. "You should have read them." I asked her to send me the section of the bylaws that classified a private lake as HOA property. She hesitated, just for a second, before saying the documentation was being finalized and would be shared soon. That hesitation told me everything. Karen wasn't enforcing an existing rule. She was building one, brick by brick, specifically to trap me. That night I dug through Grandpa Frank's old filing cabinet in the garage, boxes I hadn't opened since his funeral. Inside were yellowed deeds, hand-drawn plat maps, and a 1962 land survey with his signature at the bottom. Somewhere in that dust-covered paperwork was proof the HOA had never owned a single drop of that water. I found the original deed that night, the one transferring most of Grandpa's acreage to the original developer back in 1978. Buried in paragraph 4 was a clause reserving all riparian and mineral rights, together with permanent access to the water body known as Miller's Pond, exclusively to Frank Reyes and his heirs. My hands were trembling by the time I finished reading. I photographed every page and made 3 separate backups that same night. One on a cloud drive, one on a flash drive, one printed and locked in our home safe. Something told me Karen wasn't the type to accept a phone call correction gracefully. If this was going to become a fight, I intended to walk in already armed. The next morning I called the county recorder's office to confirm the deed was still valid and on file. The clerk, a patient woman named Diane, pulled the record in under 2 minutes. "Yep, it's here," she said. "Riparian rights reserved to Frank Reyes. Recorded 1978. Never modified." I nearly laughed out loud from relief right there in my kitchen. I decided to handle it calmly, the adult way, instead of escalating. I emailed the HOA board directly, attaching the deed and politely requesting the fine be rescinded due to a documented ownership error. 3 board members responded within the hour, apologetic and clearly uncomfortable. Karen's response, when it finally came, was one cold sentence. "This changes nothing." That single sentence told me who I was really dealing with. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. Karen had seen the proof and decided the facts were an inconvenience rather than an answer. I forwarded everything to Sarah that night, who read it twice and said quietly, "She's not backing down because backing down was never the plan." Word spread through the neighborhood faster than any HOA newsletter ever could. Neighbors started stopping me at the mailbox, asking quiet questions, sharing their own stories about Karen's fines. A retired nurse named Gloria admitted she'd paid a $600 fine for a mailbox flag Karen didn't like rather than fight it. "It's easier to just pay," she whispered. That was the pattern. I realized. Karen didn't need her rules to be legal. She just needed people too tired, too busy, or too intimidated to challenge her. Most residents folded before it ever reached a hearing. I was the first person in years, apparently, who'd actually found paperwork proving her wrong on paper, in ink, on record. I requested a formal hearing before the full HOA board, hoping reasonable people among them would see sense once the deed was placed directly in front of them. The meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Conveniently, the same week Karen announced a temporary lake closure for safety inspections. My daughter's Saturday mornings were quietly being taken from her. Emily cried the first Saturday we couldn't go fishing. Not dramatically, just a small quiet sniffle over her untouched tackle box on the counter. That hurt more than any fine ever could. Sarah hugged her and told her it was temporary. I promised myself, standing in that kitchen, that I would make sure that promise came true. I started attending every HOA meeting after that, sitting quietly in the back, taking notes, watching how Karen operated the room like a conductor with a very small orchestra. She interrupted dissent smoothly, redirected hard questions into vague committee assignments, and always ended contentious topics with, "Let's circle back next month," a phrase that meant nothing would change. One evening after a meeting, an older board member named Richard Cole caught me in the parking lot. He glanced around before speaking. "Keep that deed somewhere safe," he said quietly. "And keep records of everything she sends you. This isn't the first time she's done something like this." Then he walked away before I could ask what he meant. Richard's warning stuck with me for days. I began saving every email, every letter, every voicemail from the HOA office, building a folder labeled simply Karen on my laptop. I didn't know yet what was coming. But something in Richard's tone told me this fight was bigger than one fine, one lake, or one stubborn woman with a clipboard. The formal hearing finally arrived on a humid Tuesday evening in the community clubhouse. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows facing a long table where Karen sat flanked by 2 board allies. I brought the deed, the survey, and a printed county record confirming everything. I felt confident walking in. That confidence didn't survive the first 10 minutes. Karen opened by reading a prepared statement about protecting community resources from unauthorized private claims, her tone dripping with concern for the neighborhood's collective well-being. She never once mentioned the deed I'd emailed weeks earlier. When I raised my hand to bring it up, she cut me off. "We'll get to public comment, Daniel. Please be patient." When my turn finally came, I laid the deed on the table and read the exact clause reserving water rights to my grandfather and his heirs. The room went quiet from his seat. Karen, however, barely glanced at the paper before sliding it back across the table. "This is a personal document, not a governing one," she said flatly. I asked what that phrase even meant, since a recorded county deed is about as governing as documents get. Karen replied that the HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions superseded prior private agreements once a property joined the association, a claim with no legal basis whatsoever. 2 board members exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody corrected her out loud. Meetings ended without resolution that night. Driving home, Sarah asked how it went. I told her the truth. Karen had simply ignored the evidence in front of a room full of witnesses and nobody stopped her. "That's not confidence," Sarah said after a long pause. "That's someone who already knows the rules don't actually matter to the people enforcing them." I couldn't argue with that. The very next week, a new sign appeared at the lake's edge: "No trespassing. HOA managed property." Someone had installed a small padlocked gate across the old dirt path Grandpa Frank built decades ago. I stood there staring at it, jaw tight, realizing Karen wasn't waiting for the hearing's outcome. She was building facts on the ground. Literally. I called a local attorney that same afternoon, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Alvarez who specialized in property disputes. She reviewed the deed over email within an hour and called back sounding almost amused. "This is about as clean a reservation of rights as I've ever seen," she said.
"Whoever's fining you has no..."
Patricia explained that HOA covenants cannot override rights reserved in a prior recorded deed, especially one predating the association's own founding documents by decades. She offered to send Karen a formal cease and desist letter. I hesitated only briefly before agreeing. Something told me a polite conversation with Karen Whitfield had officially reached the end of its usefulness. The cease and desist letter went out on law firm letterhead the following Monday, citing the recorded 1978 deed and demanding immediate removal of the gate and rescission of the fine within 14 days. I expected panic, or at least a phone call. Instead, 3 days later, Karen posted a neighborhood-wide email accusing me of attempting to intimidate volunteer board members. That email painted me as the aggressor, twisting a simple legal notice into some kind of harassment campaign against a dedicated community servant. Neighbors who'd never met me started sending odd, cautious glances at the mailbox. Karen had turned my own defense into ammunition against me, and she'd done it without technically lying about a single fact. Sarah found this the most unsettling part of the entire ordeal. "She's not stupid," she said one night, staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. "She knows exactly how far to twist things without crossing into something provably false." I hated agreeing with her, but the pattern was undeniable. Karen was careful, calculated, and dangerously good at optics. I decided to counter the narrative quietly instead of publicly, sharing the deed directly with individual neighbors who reached out, letting the paperwork speak instead of arguing on the community app where Karen controlled every thread. Slowly, a few allies emerged: Richard Cole, Gloria the retired nurse, and surprisingly, a young couple new to the neighborhood named the Whitakers. The Whitakers, turned out, had also received an unexplained fine months earlier for a fence height violation that didn't match anything in the actual bylaws. They'd paid it rather than fight, assuming it was standard procedure. Once they saw my deed and heard Karen's excuse-laden response, something shifted in their expressions. "We should have questioned this sooner, Mrs. Whitaker admitted. Slowly a quiet network formed. Neighbors comparing notes over backyard fences and group texts that carefully avoided the official community app. Karen's fines, turned out, followed an odd pattern: always vague violations, always suspiciously round dollar amounts, and always payable directly through a private payment portal rather than the HOA's standard dues account. Nobody had noticed until now. Richard Cole, still a board member himself, offered to quietly request the HOA's fine collection records at the next finance meeting, citing his fiduciary duty as justification. Karen, he said, always found reasons to postpone financial disclosures, citing ongoing legal reviews or pending audits that never seemed to actually conclude. It was, he admitted, oddly convenient timing every single time. I still went to the lake sometimes, just to check on it, standing at the locked gate like a man visiting something taken from him. Emily asked once if we could just cut the padlock. I told her no, that this needed to be won properly, with paper and patience, not bolt cutters. She didn't fully understand, but she trusted me. That trust weighed on me more than anything Karen had done so far. My daughter believed her father could fix this. I believed it too. Mostly, on good days. On bad days, watching the padlock glint in the afternoon sun, I wondered how much damage a woman with a clipboard and unchecked authority could really do to one family's small piece of peace. 2 weeks after the cease and desist letter, Karen's attorney finally responded, not by conceding, but by claiming the HOA's own covenants included a resource management clause from 2015 that supposedly granted the association authority over all water features within platted boundaries. Patricia requested a copy immediately. It arrived 3 days later, oddly, freshly notarized rather than pulled from an archive. Patricia noticed the notarization date immediately, stamped just 5 days after our original cease and desist letter was sent, not from 2015 as claimed. Either this clause sat unnotarized and unrecorded for 9 years, she said carefully, or someone just created it. That single detail turned a property dispute into something that suddenly smelled a lot like fraud. I couldn't sleep that night, replaying every interaction with Karen, wondering how deep this actually went. A retroactively dated document wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was, potentially, a crime. Patricia advised patience, warning that accusing someone of forgery without ironclad proof could backfire badly in court. Let's build the case brick by brick, she said. Quietly, Richard Cole, when I mentioned the notarization discrepancy, went pale. I sat on that board in 2015, he said slowly. There was no resource management clause discussed that year. Nothing even close. Meeting minutes, stored on an external hard drive from his time as board secretary years earlier. I thanked him and waited. 3 days later, Richard called sounding shaken. His 2015 minutes, complete and unaltered, showed no mention whatsoever of any resource management clause. What they did show, buried in a budget line item, was an unexplained $22,000 payment to something called Whitfield Property Consulting LLC, a name that sounded uncomfortably, unmistakably close to Karen's own. I stared at that name on my phone screen for a long time. Whitfield Property Consulting LLC. Karen's married name was Whitfield. This wasn't proof of anything conclusive yet, Patricia warned, but it was a thread worth pulling. And threads, once you start pulling them, have an uncomfortable habit of unraveling entire sweaters. One loop at a time. We decided to formally request the HOA's complete financial records through the state's homeowner association disclosure laws, which required boards to provide such documents to any dues-paying member upon written request. Karen, as president, would be legally obligated to comply within 30 days. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the ground beneath her was finally shifting. Karen didn't respond to the disclosure request within the legal window, which itself was its own small violation. Patricia sent a follow-up citing the specific statute and deadline. 2 days later, A heavily redacted PDF arrived. Entire sections blacked out under vague claims of attorney-client privilege that made no logical sense for basic vendor payment records. Something was clearly being hidden. Richard reviewed the redacted document line by line with me over coffee one Saturday morning, comparing it against his own old records. Several vendor names had vanished entirely between his archived version and Karen's official one. "These aren't redactions," he said quietly. "These are deletions. Anyone official gets a proper look at this." I mentioned the growing suspicion to Sarah that evening, and she immediately connected it to something else. 6 months earlier, the HOA had announced a special assessment of $1,200 per household for emergency infrastructure repairs that never seemed to actually happen. No new fencing appeared. No repaved roads. Just an assessment, collected and quietly absorbed somewhere. That special assessment alone, across roughly 90 households in Whispering Pines, totaled well over $100,000. The exact figure Karen had fined me, coincidentally or not. Patricia noted the pattern immediately. "She's not just enforcing bad rules," she said grimly.
She may be running an entire financial...
Gloria, the retired nurse, mentioned during one of our quiet backyard conversations that she'd once seen Karen's husband, Gary, driving a brand new luxury truck despite both of them supposedly working modest jobs, him in insurance sales, her unofficially volunteering as HOA president, a position that legally should have paid nothing at all. Nothing about a truck proved fraud on its own, obviously, but the small details were stacking up into something larger than coincidence. I started keeping a private timeline, cross-referencing HOA assessments, board meeting dates, and any visible lifestyle changes neighbors mentioned. It felt uncomfortably like detective work for a man who just wanted to take his daughter fishing. Karen, seemingly sensing the tide beginning to turn, escalated instead of retreating. A new notice appeared citywide on the community app. Unauthorized fishing fines would now accrue daily interest at 5% until paid in full. My original $100,000 fine, left unaddressed on paper even amid our legal dispute, was technically compounding by roughly $137 per day. Growing while we fought her, I brought this new development straight to Patricia, furious and slightly panicked despite knowing the fine itself had no legal foundation whatsoever. "She's trying to pressure a settlement before discovery gets too deep," Patricia explained calmly. "The scarier the number looks, the more likely regular people fold. It's psychological warfare disguised as bureaucracy. Don't let it work on you." Sarah, to her credit, refused to let the growing number rattle her either, though I caught her doing quiet mental math at the kitchen table more than once. "We have the deed," she reminded me constantly, like a mantra. "We have Richard's old records. We have a fake notarization date. This isn't a fight we're losing, Daniel. This is one we're winning slowly." Emily, oblivious to most of the legal complexity, only cared about one thing: when could she fish again? I promised her soon, though privately I wasn't entirely certain of the timeline anymore. Karen had proven willing to fabricate documents and manipulate optics. There was no telling how far she'd escalate before this ended. One way or another, Richard suggested quietly involving the county assessor's office directly, since any legitimate HOA claim over the lake would require it to appear on official property tax records as association-owned common area. If the lake had always been privately taxed under my family's name, that alone would settle the ownership question beyond any argument Karen's lawyer could construct. The county assessor confirmed within days, over the phone, that the parcel containing Miller's Pond had been separately taxed under the Reyes family name continuously since 1979, never once transferred, reclassified, or absorbed into the HOA's common area designation. Patricia called it, cheerfully, the nail in the coffin. I finally allowed myself a small, cautious sense of relief. That relief didn't last long. 2 days later, Karen filed a formal complaint against me with the County Code Enforcement Office, alleging unpermitted structures near the lake, referring to the small wooden dock Grandpa Frank built in 1985. An inspector was scheduled to visit within the week. It felt less like enforcement and more like retaliation dressed in official paperwork. The code enforcement inspector, a tired-looking man named Officer Delgado, arrived on a Thursday afternoon and walked the dock's perimeter with visible boredom. He measured a few boards, checked a permit database on his tablet, and shrugged. This predates current permitting requirements by decades, he said. Grandfathered in. Clearly didn't check the history first. I couldn't help feeling a flicker of satisfaction watching Karen's complaint collapse in under 20 minutes of actual scrutiny. But the satisfaction was quickly replaced by unease. Karen wasn't losing ground gracefully. She was simply firing off complaint after complaint, hoping something, anything, would stick before the truth about her finances caught up with her first. That same week, an anonymous envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address, containing printed bank statements for an account under Whitfield Property Consulting, LLC. I didn't recognize the sender's handwriting, but the timing felt deliberate. Someone inside the HOA's orbit clearly wanted this exposed and lacked the courage, or safety, to do it openly themselves. The statements showed regular deposits matching HOA assessment cycles almost exactly, followed by withdrawals labeled vaguely as consulting fees and management services. Patricia examined them carefully, cautioning that anonymously obtained documents carried legal complications regarding admissibility, but agreed they gave us a clear roadmap of exactly where to direct future, properly subpoenaed financial discovery requests. I couldn't stop wondering who'd sent that envelope. Richard denied it convincingly when I asked. Seeming almost hurt, I'd suspect him of anonymity when he'd been open with me the entire time. Gloria denied it too. Whoever the source was, they clearly had access closer to Karen than any of my current allies. Someone inside the machine was turning. Sarah suggested it might be Gary, Karen's own husband, hinting at possible marital tension neighbors had whispered about for months. I dismissed the idea initially as gossip, but the more I thought about the truck, the consulting LLC, and the timing of the leak, the less far-fetched it seemed. Sometimes the closest witnesses are the ones standing nearest the fire. Whoever the source was, the leaked statements gave Patricia enough specific detail to draft a formal demand for a full independent financial audit of the HOA, citing suspected misappropriation of association funds. Under state law, a certain percentage of dues-paying members could force such an audit through a signed petition. Richard began quietly gathering signatures the following week. Gathering signatures proved easier than expected once neighbors realized their own fines and assessments might be connected to the same scheme. Gloria's $600 mailbox fine. The Whitaker's fence violation. My $100,000 fishing fine. All of it, potentially, feeding the same private account under a suspiciously familiar last name. Anger, once ignited, spread through Whispering Pines fast. Within 10 days, Richard had collected signatures well beyond the required threshold. A stack of paper representing genuine, quiet fury from dozens of households who'd simply never had a reason to compare notes before. Karen, informed of the petition at a hastily called board meeting, reportedly went very quiet for the first time anyone could remember in months. The audit request became public knowledge fast, posted to the community app by Richard himself before Karen could suppress it. Comments flooded in from residents sharing their own suspicious fines and assessments, a pattern emerging in real time for everyone to see. Karen deleted the thread within an hour, but screenshots, inevitably, had already spread through group chats. I felt something shift that week. A change in the neighborhood's collective mood. People stopped avoiding eye contact at the mailbox. Neighbors who'd quietly paid unjust fines started messaging me directly, sharing dates and amounts, building an unofficial but increasingly damning record entirely independent of anything Karen could delete or redact from the official HOA channels. Karen called an emergency board meeting, closed to general residents, citing personnel matters requiring confidentiality. Richard, still technically a sitting board member, attended and later described the atmosphere as tense, almost frantic. Karen allegedly proposed dissolving the audit petition through some obscure bylaw technicality nobody could actually locate in the association's official governing documents. Richard refused to support the maneuver, and reportedly 2 other board members, emboldened by growing resident pressure, refused alongside him. Karen, for the first time in the meeting's history according to Richard, raised her voice, accusing the board of abandoning their duty to protect the association from frivolous outside interference. Nobody in that room believed her anymore. That same night, Patricia received a call from Karen's attorney proposing a private settlement, full rescission of my fine, removal of the lake gate, in exchange for me publicly withdrawing support for the financial audit and signing a confidentiality agreement about everything discovered so far. It was, unmistakably, an offer born entirely out of fear. I told Patricia immediately that the answer was no. This was never just about my fine anymore. Gloria's $600. The Whitaker's fence. Had quietly paid over the years without ever comparing notes. The Karen wanted quiet. She should have thought about that before fabricating a notarization date on a fake covenant clause. Patricia relayed my refusal, professionally but firmly, and reported that Karen's attorney sounded genuinely surprised, as if he'd expected easy compliance from a tired homeowner just wanting his fishing rights back quietly. That expectation, I realized with some satisfaction, revealed exactly how Karen had operated successfully for years, betting correctly that most people simply wanted peace over justice. Sarah asked me that night if I was scared, watching the situation clearly escalating beyond anything either of us anticipated when this started as a simple, absurd fishing fine. I told her the truth. I was scared, but angrier than scared, and angry enough now to see this through completely, wherever the financial trail actually led. Emily, sensing tension in the house despite our efforts to shield her, asked one evening if Karen was a bad guy. I hesitated, wanting to model fairness even toward someone who clearly deserved little of it. She made bad choices, I told her carefully, and now she has to face what happens when people finally notice. Emily nodded solemnly. The audit, once formally triggered by the petition threshold, required the HOA to hire an independent certified public accountant within 30 days, per state association law. Karen attempted to nominate a personal family friend for the position, a maneuver Richard flagged immediately as a conflict of interest. The board, newly emboldened, rejected her nomination outright, unanimously. An actual independent accountant, a meticulous woman named Ms. Chun with 2 decades of forensic experience, was selected instead through a neutral bidding process. She requested 3 years of complete financial records within her first week, citing standard audit protocol. Karen's response, predictably, cited ongoing document organization efforts as a reason for delay. Ms. pressed.
Ms. quickly, informing the board in writing that continued delays would be documented formally as potential obstruction, a phrase carrying real legal weight under state nonprofit association statutes. Karen, cornered for perhaps the first time without an easy procedural exit, finally began producing records, though notably incomplete ones, missing entire quarters of transaction history.
The missing quarters, Ms. Chun noted dryly in her preliminary report, happened to align almost perfectly with periods of unusually high special assessment collection. Coincidence? She wrote carefully in professional language. Seemed statistically unlikely. Richard forwarded me that preliminary report the moment it landed in board members' inboxes, and I read it twice, hands genuinely shaking. That night, lying awake, I realized this had stopped being simply about a lake or a fishing rod months ago. Karen had built something larger, something that had quietly extracted money from dozens of trusting families under the guise of community management. My $100,000 fine wasn't an isolated act of pettiness. It was one thread in a much bigger operation. For a brief stretch after the preliminary audit findings, things went strangely quiet. No new fines appeared on the community app. The lake gate stayed locked, but no additional notices arrived. Karen seemed to retreat entirely from public HOA communications, delegating routine announcements to other board members while Ms. Chen's formal audit continued methodically in the background. Sarah called it the calm before something, and I agreed, though we both allowed ourselves a small, cautious exhale during those weeks. Emily got to enjoy a quiet stretch of normal childhood. At least, birthday parties and school projects taking priority over lawyers and audits, even as the unresolved fine still technically sat compounding somewhere in HOA paperwork. Richard mentioned during one of our coffee meetings that Karen had reportedly stopped attending non-mandatory community events entirely, skipping the neighborhood 4th of July barbecue for the first time in 6 years. Whether from shame, strategy, or simple exhaustion, nobody could say for certain. But her usual omnipresence had noticeably, unmistakably faded from daily neighborhood life. I used the quiet period to reconnect with Emily properly, taking her to a public lake 40 minutes away most weekends, watching her cast her line with steadily improving technique. It wasn't Miller's Pond, and she knew it, but she never complained. "It's still fishing with you, Dad," she said once, and I nearly had to look away so she wouldn't see my eyes. Gloria mentioned, during one backyard conversation, that she'd heard through a cousin working at the county clerk's office that Karen had recently filed paperwork attempting to transfer certain personal assets into her husband Gary's name alone. It read, "To anyone paying attention," like someone quietly preparing for a storm she suspected was coming. Sooner rather than later, Patricia confirmed something similar through her own professional contacts. That asset transfers timed suspiciously close to an active financial audit could later be challenged in court as fraudulent conveyance, specifically designed to shield funds from anticipated legal judgments. "She's not hiding from the audit," Patricia said. "She's preparing to survive losing it." That quiet period ended abruptly one Tuesday morning when Ms. Chen's completed forensic audit landed in board members' inboxes simultaneously, a document running nearly 60 pages. Richard called me before I'd even finished my coffee, voice tight with something between vindication and disbelief. "Daniel," he said, "you need to sit down and read this immediately." The audit revealed that over 4 years, roughly $340,000 in HOA assessments and fines had been routed through Whitfield Property Consulting LLC under vague consulting services. Invoices with no supporting documentation whatsoever, no contracts, no deliverables, no evidence of any actual consulting work having ever taken place for the association at any point.
MS specifically flagged my $100,000 fine, still technically unpaid and compounding, as part of a documented pattern where large fines against individual homeowners consistently preceded matching payments to the same suspicious LLC within weeks. The pattern was, in her precise professional language, consistent with systematic misappropriation of association funds under color of enforcement authority.
I read that sentence 4 times, feeling something between fury and vindication settle in my chest. This had never been about protecting property values or managing a shared resource. It had been, from the very beginning, a calculated extraction scheme, and my daughter's Saturday fishing mornings had simply been convenient collateral damage in Karen Whitfield's private financial operation. The completed audit was legally required to be shared with all dues-paying members per state disclosure statutes. And Richard, no longer willing to protect Karen's reputation over residents' rights, posted the full document to the community app himself the same afternoon it arrived. Within hours, it had been downloaded, screenshotted, and forwarded across nearly every household group chat. Karen's response, when it finally came, was a defensive email calling the audit incomplete and taken out of context, promising a full explanation at the next scheduled board meeting. Nobody, at this point, believed a word of it. The comment section beneath her own message filled instantly with residents demanding her immediate resignation. Some polite, most decidedly not. Sarah read the audit report over my shoulder that evening, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "She really thought nobody would ever check," she said quietly. I nodded, thinking of Richard's old 2015 minutes, the fake notarization date, the anonymous bank statements, and the county assessor's simple, unshakable confirmation. Karen had built her empire on the assumption of nobody checking anything. Emily, too young to grasp financial fraud fully, still understood the basic shape of it when I explained things gently that night. "She took people's money and lied about it," she summarized simply, and I told her that was exactly right. "Is she going to get in trouble?" she asked. "I think so, sweetheart," I told her honestly. "I really do." That night, For the first time in months, I slept without replaying every conversation with Karen on a loop in my head. The audit had done what months of arguing never could. It had turned my private fight into undeniable, documented public fact, backed by forensic accounting rather than deed clauses and legal letters alone. The tide had officially, unmistakably turned. The next board meeting drew the largest crowd Whispering Pines had ever seen at a community gathering. Folding chairs spilling out into the clubhouse hallway. Residents standing along every wall. Karen arrived 15 minutes late. Sunglasses still on despite the overcast sky. Flanked by an attorney nobody recognized. The room's energy felt less like a meeting and more like a trial. She opened by attempting her usual tone. Calm and slightly condescending. Calling the audit a misunderstanding of standard consulting arrangements. A resident near the front, someone I'd never even spoken to before, stood up immediately and asked her to name a single deliverable Whitfield Property Consulting LLC had ever produced for the association. Karen had no answer ready. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably long. Karen's attorney whispering something in her ear before she finally offered a vague answer about strategic planning services, with no specifics whatsoever. MS. Present at the meeting as required by audit protocol. Calmly stated for the record that no such services appeared in any documentation provided across the entire 4-year period reviewed. Richard, sitting at the board table rather than in the crowd, finally spoke up publicly for the first time about the fake 2015 Resource Management Clause, explaining clearly how his own original meeting minutes contained no mention of it whatsoever. Karen's face, for the first time in this entire ordeal, showed something other than practiced composure. Genuine panic, briefly, unmistakably. A murmur rippled through the crowd as residents began openly connecting dots. Their own old fines. The mysterious special assessment. The notarization date discrepancy Patricia had flagged months earlier. Someone in the back shouted, only half joking, "Where's my $600 mailbox fine money, Karen?" The room actually laughed. Tension briefly breaking before settling right back into simmering anger. Karen attempted to regain control by threatening to adjourn the meeting early, citing disorderly conduct from residents, a phrase that had worked on smaller, more intimidated crowds in years past. This time, however, dozens of voices simply refused to quiet down, demanding answers rather than procedural escape routes. For once, her usual tools of control simply didn't function.
Maintaining strict professional neutrality throughout, calmly reiterated her core finding for the assembled crowd. Over $340,000 in association funds appeared to have been diverted to an LLC directly connected to the sitting HOA president, with my own $100,000 fine specifically flagged as part of the documented pattern. Applause, oddly, broke out at that statement.
I hadn't planned to speak that night, but something pulled me to my feet anyway. I told the room simply about Grandpa Frank's deed, about the locked gate, about Emily's empty tackle box sitting untouched for months. This was never just about me, I said. It was about anyone Karen decided couldn't fight back. Turns out we all could. Together, the applause that followed felt different from the earlier laughter. Quieter but somehow heavier with real meaning. Karen sat rigid at the head table, sunglasses finally removed, staring at some fixed point on the wall rather than at any of us. Her attorney whispered something urgent in her ear. She didn't respond, didn't move, didn't even seem to hear him. The board, without any formal vote even required under emergency bylaw provisions, unanimously agreed to place Karen on immediate administrative suspension pending a full investigation and potential referral to local law enforcement regarding the misappropriated funds. Richard read the motion aloud himself, voice steady despite what must have been years of quietly watching this coming and unable to stop it. Karen stood abruptly as the motion passed, gathering her things without a word, her attorney trailing behind her toward the exit. Someone near the door, not unkindly exactly, said, "Have a good night, Karen," in a tone dripping with an irony everyone in that room understood completely. She didn't respond. The parking lot alone. I watched through the clubhouse window as she reached her SUV, standing beside it for a long moment before finally getting in. Whatever she was feeling in that instant, I couldn't tell from a distance. And honestly, after everything, I found I didn't particularly care to know. My focus that night belonged entirely to the people still inside that room. The meeting continued for another hour afterward, residents openly sharing stories now without fear of retaliation. Fines nobody had ever contested. Assessments nobody had ever questioned. A pattern emerging so clearly that Ms. Chun suggested expanding her audit scope backward, potentially covering Karen's entire 6-year tenure as HOA president rather than just the 4 years initially reviewed. Sarah squeezed my hand tightly throughout that final hour, occasionally glancing at me with an expression somewhere between exhaustion and quiet triumph. "You did this," she whispered at one point. I shook my head. I told her. "Richard, Gloria, the Whitakers, whoever sent that anonymous envelope. This took a lot more than just one deed and one lake." Driving home that night, Emily already asleep in the back seat despite the late hour, Sarah asked what happened next. Practically speaking, I told her honestly that I didn't fully know yet, but that Patricia had mentioned potential criminal referral, civil recovery lawsuits from affected residents, and almost certainly the end of Karen Whitfield's HOA career. Permanently, in Whispering Pines at least. The following morning brought a flood of neighborhood text messages and community app posts. Residents thanking me directly for pushing back when so many others had simply paid quietly for years. It felt strange receiving gratitude for something that had started purely from wanting to take my daughter fishing without government-adjacent interference. Sometimes doing right by yourself does right by everyone. Richard called midday to update me on developments. The local sheriff's department had been formally notified of the audit findings, and a detective specializing in financial crimes would be reviewing the case for potential charges of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement. The fake notarization date on the fabricated 2015 clause alone, Patricia noted, constituted a separate and serious criminal offense. I asked Richard, almost hesitantly, if he knew anything about Gary, Karen's husband, given the earlier suspicions about asset transfers and the anonymous envelope neither of us had ever fully solved. Richard admitted he didn't know for certain, but that Gary had reportedly filed for separation from Karen just 2 days after the audit results became public knowledge. That detail landed differently than I expected. Whatever Gary's involvement or innocence in this entire scheme, the timing suggested someone finally choosing self-preservation over loyalty once the truth became undeniable and public. I thought again of that unsigned envelope of bank statements, wondering, Not for the first time. Whether Gary himself had been the quiet source all along. Patricia called that afternoon with news of her own. My formal fine, still technically on the books despite everything, had been officially and unanimously voided by the newly reconstituted board, with a written apology issued directly to my family for what they called clear administrative overreach exceeding any legitimate association authority. It felt anticlimactic after everything. Oddly small. Emily's reaction, when I told her the fishing gate would finally reopen, mattered far more to me than any board apology ever could. She actually cheered, running to grab her tackle box from the closet where it had sat untouched for months, insisting we go that very evening despite the late hour. Sarah and I exchanged a smile neither of us tried to hide. That evening, standing at the lake's edge as Emily cast her line into water that had always, legally, belonged to our family, I finally allowed myself to fully exhale. The padlocked gate lay open on its hinges. Chain cut days earlier by county order once ownership was formally, publicly, undeniably confirmed once again. Some fights end quietly. This one didn't, but it ended right. Emily caught a small bluegill within 20 minutes, holding it up triumphantly despite its unremarkable size. First fish since Karen, she announced solemnly, as though marking an actual historical era. Sarah laughed harder than I'd heard her laugh in months. I photographed the moment, knowing I'd want to remember exactly how ordinary and perfect it felt to simply fish again. I thought, watching Emily release that fish back into the water, about how close Karen had come to making this permanent. Not just the locked gate, but the erosion of trust. The quiet resignation of neighbors who'd simply paid unjust fines rather than fight. Her real damage was never the money alone. It was teaching an entire neighborhood to expect unfairness. Over the following weeks, the criminal investigation moved faster than any of us anticipated, aided significantly by Ms. Chen's meticulous forensic audit and the recovered bank statements matching HOA assessment cycles almost perfectly. The detective assigned to the case, a methodical woman named Detective Ruiz, requested formal statements from Richard, myself, Gloria, and several other affected residents. Detective Ruiz asked me directly, during my interview, whether I believed Karen had targeted me specifically because of the lake's potential value, or simply because I seemed like an easy target initially. I told her honestly I believed both were true. She wanted the lake for eventual community amenity branding, and she assumed, wrongly, that I'd fold quietly like others had. That assumption, more than any single fabricated document, seemed to be Karen's actual downfall throughout this entire saga. She'd built a system that worked flawlessly against residents unwilling or unable to dig into old family paperwork, hire an attorney, or push back publicly. My grandfather's stubborn insistence on reserving water rights decades earlier had simply broken her entire model. Richard mentioned during a follow-up conversation that several other residents, emboldened by the public audit and criminal investigation, had come forward with their own previously unreported grievances. Fines for non-existent violations, assessments for repairs never actually completed. Even one family claiming Karen had pressured them into selling their home below market value years earlier under vague threats. That last claim, involving the Petersons, a family who'd moved away nearly 3 years prior, particularly unsettled me. If true, Karen's abuse of power extended far beyond financial fraud into something closer to genuine harassment and coercion. Detective Ruiz confirmed she was following up on that specific lead as part of the expanding scope of her investigation. Sarah and I discussed, more than once during those weeks, how strange it felt watching a woman who'd once controlled our entire neighborhood's daily existence slowly reduced to a subject of criminal inquiry and neighborhood gossip. Power like hers never survives real scrutiny, Sarah said one evening. It only ever survives people being too tired or scared to look closely. Karen, notably, made no public statements during this period. Her HOA email account deactivated automatically once her administrative suspension became permanent following the board's formal vote. Her house, according to Gloria, sat unusually quiet, blinds drawn most days, Gary's car noticeably absent from the driveway more often than not as their separation apparently progressed toward something more permanent. I felt, surprisingly, a flicker of something almost like pity watching all this unfold from a distance, quickly extinguished each time I remembered Emily's empty tackle box, Gloria's unjust mailbox fine, or the Petersons' alleged forced sale. Whatever personal unraveling Karen was experiencing, it existed entirely because of choices she alone had made, repeatedly, deliberately, over years. The county formally filed felony charges against Karen roughly 6 weeks after the audit's public release. Forgery for the fabricated 2015 notarized clause,
and embezzlement for the diverted association funds, totaling now over $380,000 once MS. Chen's expanded audit scope covering her full tenure was complete. Whitfield Property Consulting LLC, turned out, had never filed a single legitimate business tax return.
That last detail, oddly, felt like the most damning of all somehow, not the forged document, not the diverted funds, but the sheer laziness of an LLC created purely as a pass-through account with no actual pretense of legitimate operation whatsoever. Karen hadn't built an elaborate criminal enterprise. She'd simply exploited nobody bothering to check for years. Patricia explained that criminal charges would proceed entirely separate from any civil recovery efforts residents might pursue. And several neighbors, including Gloria and the Whitakers, began exploring a class action lawsuit against Karen personally to recover fraudulently collected fines and assessments. I declined to join initially, given my own fine had already been fully voided by that point. Richard convinced me otherwise over coffee one morning, pointing out that months of legal fees, lost fishing time, and genuine stress inflicted on my family deserved recognition beyond a simple voided fine and written apology. I discussed it with Sarah that night, and we agreed to join the emerging civil suit alongside roughly a dozen other affected households. Patricia agreed to represent our small group collectively, given her existing familiarity with the case and the deed dispute that had started this entire unraveling. She estimated, cautiously, that combined damages across all plaintiffs could reach several $100,000, assuming Karen's remaining assets, whatever survived the earlier suspicious transfers to Gary, could actually cover any eventual judgment. That question of recoverable assets worried Patricia more than the legal merits themselves. Winning a judgment means nothing, she explained, if there's nothing left to collect against. She mentioned the possibility of challenging the earlier asset transfers to Gary as fraudulent conveyance, potentially clawing back funds specifically moved to shield them from anticipated legal consequences. Gary, notably, hired his own separate attorney once the civil suit scope became clear, reportedly cooperating with Detective Ruiz's investigation in exchange for assurances he wouldn't face charges himself for assets transferred to his name. Whether this confirmed his innocence or simply revealed a working knowledge of how to protect himself first, nobody could say with total certainty. Gloria mentioned overhearing, through her cousin at the county clerk's office once again, that Gary had reportedly told investigators he'd suspected something was wrong with Karen's HOA finances for over a year, but had chosen not to ask questions directly, assuming, in his words, that it wasn't really his business how she ran her volunteer position. That excuse, when Richard relayed it to me later, struck both of us as remarkably weak given the luxury truck, the timed asset transfers, and the convenient separation filing mere days after public exposure. Willful ignorance, Patricia noted dryly, made for a convenient legal shield but rarely held up entirely once investigators started examining financial records closely enough. Meanwhile, life in Whispering Pines slowly began returning to something resembling normal, minus Karen's constant presence at every community function. A temporary board, led by Richard as acting president, focused primarily on reviewing and reversing years of questionable fines, offering refunds where documentation supported clear administrative overreach rather than legitimate rule violations under the association's actual bylaws. Gloria received her $600 mailbox fine back within weeks, practically in tears when Richard personally delivered the reimbursement check to her door. The Whitakers received their fence violation refund shortly after. Dozens of smaller fines, collected quietly over years from residents too tired or intimidated to fight, slowly began working their way back to rightful owners. I found myself, oddly, becoming something of an unofficial spokesperson for the affected residents during this period, fielding questions from local reporters who'd caught wind of the unfolding scandal. A small regional news outlet ran a story titled simply, HOA President Charged with Embezzlement After Homeowners Phishing Fine Unravels Years-Long Scheme, which felt both accurate and strangely surreal to read. The article included a photo of Emily at the lake's edge, tackle box in hand, that Sarah had shared with the reporter after some hesitation. Emily, thrilled beyond reason at seeing her own photo in an actual news article, printed out 3 copies to show her entire 4th grade class the following Monday. Some small joys survive even the strangest circumstances. Detective Ruiz called with an update roughly 2 months after formal charges were filed, informing me that Karen's public defender had begun exploring plea negotiations, likely hoping to reduce potential prison time in exchange for full cooperation regarding remaining unaccounted funds. I asked, somewhat surprised, whether this meant the case wouldn't reach an actual trial. Detective Ruiz explained that plea deals were common in cases with overwhelming documented evidence, and that prosecutors often preferred guaranteed convictions with restitution commitments over the uncertainty and expense of a full jury trial. Karen, facing forgery and embezzlement charges carrying significant potential prison time, apparently understood her odds at trial looked genuinely, mathematically dismal. Patricia, meanwhile, continued building our civil suit independently of the criminal proceedings, gathering formal statements from all 12 participating households, detailing their specific financial losses, emotional distress, and in several cases, documented harassment tactics Karen had employed over years of unchecked HOA authority. The combined claim, once finalized, totaled just under $290,000. I spent an evening helping Sarah organize our own portion of that claim, including legal fees paid to Patricia, lost value from months of restricted lake access,
and even Emily's therapist recommended mention during a routine pediatric checkup about increased anxiety related to a specific...
That particular detail hit me harder than almost anything else throughout this entire process. Karen hadn't just targeted me, or even just our finances. She'd inadvertently touched my 9-year-old daughter's sense of security and fairness in the world, teaching her, briefly, that adults with clipboards and official titles could simply take things without consequence. I intended to prove otherwise, thoroughly. Emily, for her part, seemed to be processing everything with the resilient practicality only children seem to genuinely possess. Karen was mean and now she's in trouble, she summarized simply one evening while doing homework. That's how it's supposed to work, right? I told her yes. That's exactly how it was supposed to work. Even when it took a while, Sarah and I made a point after that conversation to shield Emily more carefully from ongoing legal details, letting her enjoy her recovered Saturday. Mornings at the lake without constant reminders of lawsuits, forensic audits, or criminal proceedings happening in courthouses she'd likely never even see. Some victories, we agreed, deserved to remain simply victories for a child. Richard, still serving as acting HOA president, initiated a full bylaws review with resident input, aiming to prevent any future board member from wielding the kind of unilateral, unchecked authority Karen had exploited for years. New provisions required independent financial review annually, mandatory board term limits, and crucially, explicit language protecting privately deeded property from association overreach entirely. That last provision, Richard told me with a slight smile, was being informally nicknamed the Reyes Clause among residents drafting the revised bylaws. A small but meaningful acknowledgement of how one family's stubbornly preserved 1962 water rights had ultimately protected an entire neighborhood from a very different, much darker version of community management. Just as things seemed to be settling into a more hopeful rhythm, Karen's plea negotiations collapsed unexpectedly. Detective Ruiz called to inform me that new evidence had surfaced. A separate, previously undiscovered account revealing Karen had been quietly liquidating remaining assets over recent weeks, moving funds through cryptocurrency exchanges in what prosecutors now considered active flight risk behavior. Patricia, upon hearing this, expressed genuine alarm rather than her usual measured calm. If she's liquidating assets and considering flight, she explained, the court may move to revoke bail entirely. I hadn't even fully processed that Karen had been out on bail this entire time, quietly living in her half-empty house while awaiting trial like nothing had changed. The prosecutor's office filed an emergency motion within days, citing the newly discovered cryptocurrency transfers as clear evidence of flight risk. A bail revocation hearing was scheduled immediately. Karen's public defender argued the funds were simply personal savings reallocation, unrelated to the case. An explanation that satisfied absolutely nobody familiar with even the basic outline of her situation. I attended that bail hearing out of a mixture of curiosity and something close to necessity, needing to see with my own eyes how this particular chapter would unfold. Karen appeared noticeably thinner than I remembered from the community meetings, dressed plainly, sitting beside her attorney with none of her old commanding presence. The judge's expression remained entirely unreadable throughout. The judge, after reviewing the cryptocurrency transfer evidence and hearing brief arguments from both sides, revoked Karen's bail immediately, citing genuine and substantiated flight risk given the scale of documented financial maneuvering in recent weeks. Karen was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs that same afternoon, her expression finally, unmistakably, showing real fear rather than practiced composure. Watching that moment, I expected to feel triumphant, vindicated, something resembling closure. Instead, I mostly just felt tired, the accumulated weight of nearly a year's worth of fighting settling somewhere heavy in my chest. Sarah, sitting beside me in that courtroom gallery, squeezed my hand tightly without saying anything. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, without fanfare, exactly when you least expect it. Gary, present in the courtroom as well though seated separately from Karen, reportedly showed no visible reaction to the bail revocation, according to Richard, who sat closer to the front. Their separation, now clearly finalized through recently filed paperwork, seemed to have already emotionally severed whatever remained of their marriage well before this particular legal chapter concluded. Detective Ruiz mentioned afterward that the cryptocurrency discovery had actually originated from Gary's continued cooperation with investigators, apparently unwilling to risk his own legal exposure by staying silent about Karen's recent financial behavior. Whatever loyalty had existed between them originally, it had clearly, completely dissolved somewhere over the preceding months of mounting legal pressure. With bail revoked, Karen now awaited trial from county detention, her public defender scrambling to renegotiate plea terms given the added flight risk complication weighing heavily against any leniency arguments moving forward. Patricia noted this development actually strengthened our civil suit's position significantly, since a defendant facing active incarceration rarely maintains much negotiating leverage regarding financial settlements. I felt a strange mixture of emotions processing all of this alongside Sarah that evening. Relief mixed uncomfortably with something almost like exhaustion-tinged sadness. Karen had built something genuinely harmful, targeting neighbors, fabricating documents, extracting money from trusting families for years. Watching her led away in handcuffs didn't erase that harm. Simply, finally, acknowledged it existed. Emily, thankfully shielded from the courtroom details entirely, continued her recovered fishing routine blissfully unaware of cryptocurrency transfers or bail revocation hearings. Her biggest concern that particular weekend involved whether the bluegill she'd caught previously might still be swimming somewhere nearby, and whether fish actually remembered people who'd caught and released them months earlier. I told her, honestly, that I had no idea whether fish remembered such things, but that I like to imagine they did, in their own simple fishy way. She seemed satisfied with that answer, casting her line again with the easy confidence of a child who'd never once doubted her father would eventually fix whatever adult problem had briefly interrupted their Saturdays. That confidence, undeserved as it sometimes felt given how close this had all come to genuinely unraveling, mattered more to me than any courtroom outcome ultimately could. Whatever else happened with Karen's trial, restitution, or eventual sentencing, I'd managed to preserve something simple and essential for my daughter. Trust that fairness, eventually, usually finds its way back. Richard called 2 weeks later with news that Karen's renegotiated plea deal had finally been accepted by prosecutors. Given the mounting evidence and her now compromised negotiating position following the bail revocation, She would plead guilty to embezzlement and forgery charges in exchange for a recommended sentence, full restitution commitments, and a lifetime ban from serving on any homeowners association board statewide. That lifetime ban detail struck me as almost darkly humorous given everything that had happened, as though the courts had specifically identified HOA authority itself as something requiring permanent,
formal protection from Karen Whitfield specifically, a woman who'd apparently proven singularly uniquely dangerous when handed even modest institutional power over her neighbors' daily lives.
Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, allowing time for victim impact statements to be prepared and submitted formally to the court. Patricia asked whether I wanted to write one, explaining it wasn't required but could influence the judge's final sentencing decision regarding both prison time and restitution scheduling. I told her yes, immediately, without needing time to consider it. Writing that statement took me nearly a week of false starts, wanting to capture not just the fine or the lake, but everything it had actually cost. Emily's tears over an empty tackle box, Sarah's sleepless nights doing mental math on compounding interest, the countless hours spent gathering old paperwork instead of simply enjoying an ordinary, uncomplicated American life. Gloria wrote her own statement too, describing years of quiet fear every time an HOA notice appeared in her mailbox, wondering what minor infraction might cost her hundreds of dollars this time. The Whitakers wrote about feeling like outsiders in their own new neighborhood, targeted seemingly at random for a fence height violation that never actually existed in any bylaw. Richard, despite technically being a former board colleague rather than a directly fined resident, submitted a statement as well, describing years of watching Karen consolidate power while newer or quieter board members felt too intimidated to challenge her methods directly. His statement, Patricia mentioned, carried particular weight given his insider perspective on exactly how the scheme operated internally. The collected statements, submitted together as part of the sentencing package, painted a picture far larger than any single fine or fabricated document could convey alone, a pattern of sustained, deliberate abuse of institutional trust affecting dozens of families over years, dressed up consistently in the polite, bureaucratic language of community management and property value protection. Sentencing day arrived on a cool autumn morning. The courtroom, noticeably fuller than the earlier bail hearing had been, filled with residents who'd traveled together in a small caravan of cars from Whispering Pines. Karen entered in a county jail jumpsuit rather than her old carefully curated outfits, looking smaller somehow than I remembered from any HOA meeting. The judge reviewed the plea agreement details methodically, confirming Karen's understanding of the charges and consequences before inviting victim impact statements to be read aloud. Gloria went first, her voice shaking slightly but clear, describing years of quiet financial fear that had, until recently, felt entirely unchallengeable given Karen's apparent absolute authority over the community. I read my own statement next, describing Grandpa Frank's deed, Emily's empty tackle box, and the moment I'd realized this was never really about a fishing fine at all, but about whether ordinary families deserved protection from people who mistook volunteer authority for actual, unchecked power over their neighbors' lives and finances. The judge listened without expression throughout. Karen, when finally given her own opportunity to speak before sentencing, offered a brief statement expressing regret for poor judgment and mismanagement, carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of deliberate fraud or targeted harassment. Felt, to nearly everyone in that gallery, like exactly the kind of carefully worded non-apology she'd used throughout this entire ordeal, right up to the very end. The judge, notably unimpressed by Karen's carefully hedged statement, proceeded directly to sentencing without additional comment on her remarks. Citing the scale of documented fraud, the forged notarization specifically, and the sustained pattern of targeted harassment against multiple households, the judge sentenced Karen to 4 years in state prison alongside full restitution obligations totaling $380,000. Additionally, per the plea agreement, Karen received a permanent, statewide ban from serving on any homeowners association board or holding any position of community governance authority for the remainder of her life. The gallery, myself included, remained silent throughout the formal sentencing, the weight of the moment settling in slowly rather than producing any immediate outburst. As bailiffs led Karen from the courtroom afterward, she glanced briefly toward our section of the gallery, her expression unreadable, before looking away just as quickly. Whatever she was feeling in that final moment, shame, defiance, simple exhaustion, couldn't tell. And honestly, standing there with Sarah's hand in mine, I found I finally, truly didn't need to know. Outside the courthouse afterward, Gloria hugged me tightly, tears finally spilling freely now that the formal proceedings had concluded. The Whitakers thanked Richard repeatedly for his role throughout, and Patricia gathered our small group for a brief, practical conversation about restitution timelines and the still pending civil suit that would formally determine each family's specific compensation moving forward. Restitution, Patricia explained carefully, would be paid according to a court-ordered schedule prioritizing documented direct financial losses first, meaning fines and assessments proven fraudulent through Ms. Chen's audit. Legal fee claims from our separate civil suit would be addressed independently, potentially taking additional months given the complexity of coordinating 12 separate plaintiff households. I drove home that afternoon feeling strangely hollow despite the clear, decisive outcome, the kind of exhaustion that follows finally setting down something heavy you've been carrying for far longer than seemed reasonable. Sarah noticed immediately, reaching over to squeeze my hand at a red light. "It's over," she said softly. "You can finally just be tired now." Emily, waiting at home with her grandmother who'd watched her during the sentencing hearing, asked immediately whether Karen would be in jail forever. I explained gently that it was 4 years, a long time but not forever, and that afterward Karen would never again be allowed to run a neighborhood or make rules for other families. Emily seemed satisfied with that. That evening, our small family drove out to the lake together, just to sit at its edge without fishing rods, without agendas, simply existing quietly in a place that had cost us so much stress yet ultimately remained exactly what it had always legally been, ours, protected by paperwork my grandfather had insisted on decades before any of this began. Sarah brought up something I hadn't fully considered yet. Watching the sunset reflect across the water's surface. "Your grandfather never met Karen," she said. "But somehow he still protected us from her, just by refusing to sign away something he cared about." I thought about that for a long time, the quiet, generational stubbornness that had ultimately saved us all. In the weeks following sentencing, the civil suit proceeded more smoothly than Patricia had initially anticipated, largely because Karen's guilty plea in the criminal case effectively eliminated most possible defenses in the parallel civil proceedings. Her attorney, representing her remaining interests, focused primarily on negotiating payment timelines given her now severely limited financial assets following asset seizure proceedings. Gary's earlier asset transfers, once formally challenged as fraudulent conveyance by Patricia's legal team, were successfully clawed back into the recoverable estate available for restitution and civil judgment payments. The luxury truck Gloria had mentioned months earlier was seized and sold, its proceeds added directly to the growing restitution fund benefiting all 12 affected households collectively. I found a strange, almost poetic satisfaction in that particular detail, the very symbol of Karen's quietly extracted wealth, that unnecessarily expensive truck, ultimately liquidated to repay the families she'd defrauded to afford it in the first place. Patricia called it appropriately circular, which felt like exactly the right description for how thoroughly this entire scheme had unraveled. The civil suit ultimately settled rather than proceeding to full trial, given the overwhelming documented evidence already established through the criminal case and forensic audit. Karen agreed, through her attorney, to a combined settlement of $310,000 distributed across all 12 plaintiff households according to documented individual losses, legal fees, and additional compensation for sustained emotional distress throughout the ordeal. My family's specific portion, once finalized, covered Patricia's full legal fees, compensation for the months of restricted lake access, and additional damages related to Emily's documented anxiety during the height of the conflict. It wasn't a fortune by any means, but it represented something more valuable than money alone. Formal, undeniable acknowledgement that we'd been genuinely wronged. Richard, still serving as HOA president through the remainder of what would have been Karen's term, oversaw the final distribution of restitution and settlement funds personally, ensuring every affected family received their portion promptly rather than allowing bureaucratic delay to compound what had already been years of unnecessary financial hardship inflicted by someone who'd abused their trust completely. Gloria used part of her settlement to finally replace an aging roof she'd been postponing repairs on for years, joking that Karen had unintentionally funded home improvement for half the neighborhood. The Whitakers put their portion toward their young daughter's college fund, calling it a strange kind of silver lining neither of them had ever expected to actually receive. We used part of our own settlement toward a proper renovation of Grandpa Frank's old dock, replacing weathered boards that had somehow survived Karen's code enforcement complaint months earlier but genuinely needed updating regardless. Emily insisted on helping choose the new wood stain color, settling eventually on a deep cedar tone matching, coincidentally, the neighborhood's own name. Watching the new dock take shape that autumn, I felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for nearly a year straight. This wasn't just repaired wood. It was a physical, tangible marker that our family's claim to this land, this water, this small private piece of peace, had survived every attempt to take it away. Fabricated document by fabricated document. As restitution payments continued processing and the new dock neared completion, an unexpected complication emerged from an entirely different direction. A private developer, Meridian Lakeside Holdings, contacted me directly, having apparently tracked the recent news coverage and county records showing clear, undisputed private ownership of Miller's Pond under the Reyes family name for decades. The developer's representative, a smooth-talking man named Brett Sanderson, explained during our first phone call that Meridian had long been interested in acquiring lakefront parcels throughout the region for potential luxury development, and that our recently Very publicly confirmed clear title made Miller's Pond an unusually attractive, low-risk acquisition target compared to typically Messier disputed properties. I told Brett immediately that the lake wasn't for sale, that this had never been about property value or development potential, but about preserving something my grandfather had specifically protected for exactly this reason. Brett, undeterred, mentioned he'd follow up with a formal written offer regardless, just in case circumstances changed down the road. I hung up feeling oddly unsettled. Sarah, hearing about the call that evening, laughed at first, assuming it was simply an aggressive but ultimately harmless sales pitch. Nobody just gives up a fight like Karen's, I told her, only half joking. Even good news attracts its own complications eventually. Neither of us anticipated quite how quickly that offhand comment would prove uncomfortably accurate. Brett's formal written offer arrived within days, proposing an unusually generous $1.2 million purchase price for the lake parcel alone, contingent on immediate exclusivity and confidentiality during negotiations. Patricia, when I forwarded it to her for review, noted the aggressive timeline and unusually high price both suggested Meridian wanted this deal finalized quickly, before something changed their calculus. I called Richard, curious whether he knew anything about Meridian Lakeside Holdings given his years of community involvement and connections throughout the broader regional development scene. Richard went quiet for a moment before admitting, somewhat reluctantly, that Meridian had actually approached the HOA itself years earlier, before Karen's tenure, about potential large-scale development interest in the surrounding area. That earlier approach, Richard explained carefully, had involved Meridian's interest not just in Miller's Pond specifically, but in the broader possibility of eventually developing significant portions of Whispering Pines surrounding green space into an expanded luxury lakefront community, assuming they could consolidate enough adjacent parcels under unified private ownership control over time. This detail reframed everything for me almost instantly. Karen's original interest in classifying the lake as a shared HOA amenity suddenly made a very different kind of sense, not simply petty control, but potentially the first, calculated step toward eventually facilitating exactly this kind of large-scale development deal, positioning the HOA itself as a convenient negotiating intermediary for Meridian. I called Patricia immediately with this new theory, and she agreed it warranted serious investigation before considering Meridian's offer any further. If Karen had been secretly coordinating with developers before her fraud was exposed, this entire fishing fine saga might have been merely the opening move in a much larger, more ambitious scheme than any of us had initially realized. Detective Ruiz, when I mentioned this new angle during a follow-up call, confirmed she'd actually flagged something similar during her expanded forensic investigation, a series of unexplained meetings in Karen's calendar records with representatives from an unnamed regional development firm, dating back nearly 2 years before my original fishing fine was ever issued in the first place. That timeline detail landed heavily. 2 years before my fine. Long before Emily and I had ever drawn Karen's specific attention toward our fishing routine. This suggested the lake itself, not simply my particular family's stubbornness, had been Karen's actual long-term target all along, with my $100,000 fine serving merely as one convenient pressure tactic among several planned approaches. Detective Ruiz requested additional time to formally subpoena Meridian's own internal communications with Karen, suspecting the development company's interest might have directly incentivized, or even funded, Portions of Karen's broader fraud scheme through some form of quiet financial arrangement never captured in the HOA's own internal financial records reviewed by Ms. Chen's initial audit. I told Brett, during a follow-up call requesting more information about Meridian's history with the HOA, that I needed considerably more time before considering any purchase offer, especially given the newly emerging questions about the company's prior relationship with Karen Whitfield specifically. Brett's carefully neutral tone shifted noticeably, becoming markedly less patient than during our first conversation. I'm not sure what you think you know, Brett said carefully, but Meridian's business dealings with the previous HOA administration are entirely separate from our current good faith offer to you personally. That phrase, previous HOA administration, struck me immediately. He hadn't simply said the HOA. He'd specifically distinguished Karen's tenure as something worth mentioning separately, deliberately, defensively. Patricia noted that slip during our next strategy call, agreeing it suggested Brett, and likely Meridian more broadly, understood clearly that their prior arrangement with Karen wouldn't survive close scrutiny either. Sometimes the guilty give themselves away, she said, simply by being too careful about how they phrase an innocent-sounding sentence. I found myself agreeing entirely. Detective Ruiz's expanded subpoena eventually uncovered exactly what we'd suspected. Email correspondence between Karen and Brett spanning nearly 18 months, discussing potential community amenity restructuring that would have ultimately positioned the HOA to lease, then eventually sell several parcels including Miller's Pond to Meridian under favorable terms benefiting both parties considerably, at residents' collective expense. More damning still, one particular email revealed Karen explicitly discussing problem homeowners who might resist the plan, specifically naming my family given our documented historical claim to the lake's water rights. Karen had, in writing, described me as the main obstacle requiring resolution before finalizing terms, nearly 4 months before my actual $100,000 fine was ever issued. Reading that email excerpt, forwarded to me by Detective Ruiz once it became relevant discoverable evidence, I felt something cold settle in my chest despite everything already uncovered. This hadn't simply been petty HOA overreach or general control-obsessed pettiness. Karen had specifically, deliberately targeted my family as a calculated business obstacle requiring elimination through whatever means necessary. Sarah's reaction, reading the same email that evening, moved quickly from shock into a kind of quiet, controlled fury I'd rarely seen from her before. She wasn't just being a bully, she said slowly. She was trying to force us out of our own home, permanently, to make a real estate deal work better for people who never even lived here. Patricia confirmed that these newly discovered emails significantly strengthened both the ongoing criminal case, given clear premeditation now established, and potentially opened an entirely new avenue for civil action directly against Meridian Lakeside Holdings itself, not merely Karen personally, given the company's apparent knowing participation in a scheme designed specifically to displace my family from our own land. I called Brett one final time, informing him plainly that Meridian's offer was permanently rejected, and that Patricia would be in contact regarding potential legal action against the company directly given their documented prior coordination with Karen's now criminal scheme. Brett's composed businessman facade finally, completely cracked. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "We had no idea about her methods." That claim of ignorance felt thin against the documented email trail explicitly discussing me by name as a problem homeowner requiring resolution.
Patricia agreed entirely, noting that corporate claims of ignorance rarely survived scrutiny once internal communications proved clear knowledge of and active participation in targeting specific individuals for removal ahead of a planned commercial transaction.
Detective Ruiz, expanding her investigation formally to include Meridian Lakeside Holdings as a potential co-conspirator, requested and received a broader subpoena covering the company's internal records regarding similar dealings with other HOAs throughout the region. What emerged over subsequent weeks suggested Karen's scheme, disturbing as it already was, might not have been entirely unique after all. Meridian, turned out, had cultivated similar relationships with at least 2 other regional HOA presidents over recent years, each arrangement involving inflated fines and manufactured safety concerns, targeting specific homeowners whose properties happened to sit along parcels the developer specifically wanted consolidated for future luxury lakefront projects throughout the broader county area. This revelation transformed our small neighborhood dispute into something with genuine regional significance. Attracting attention from a state consumer protection agency investigating patterns of coordinated HOA fraud connected to predatory real estate development practices. Patricia, clearly energized by the expanding scope, began coordinating with attorneys representing homeowners from these other affected communities as well. I found myself, somewhat reluctantly, becoming a kind of unofficial spokesperson again, this time for a much broader coalition of homeowners across multiple neighborhoods who'd experienced disturbingly similar patterns of manufactured HOA fines specifically targeting properties Meridian wanted acquired. Local news coverage expanded accordingly, the story growing well beyond a single phishing fine into genuine investigative journalism territory. Sarah worried, understandably, about the growing public attention our family now faced, given Emily's earlier documented anxiety during the initial conflict. We discussed it carefully together, ultimately agreeing that limited, controlled participation in ongoing legal proceedings mattered more than complete privacy, especially knowing other families elsewhere might finally receive justice through our continued involvement. Emily, now considerably more resilient after months of watching her parents navigate this entire ordeal successfully, surprised us both by asking if she could help write a simple statement for the news, describing what it felt like getting her fishing spot back. Sarah and I agreed, carefully reviewing her words together, touched by her genuine, uncomplicated perspective on justice finally served. Her statement, brief and unpolished exactly as a 9-year-old's should be, described simply how scared she'd felt not understanding why grown-ups were fighting about fish, and how happy she felt now catching bluegill again every Saturday morning. It ran in the regional paper alongside the broader Meridian investigation coverage, humanizing the story in ways adult testimony rarely managed. Detective Ruiz's expanded investigation eventually resulted in additional criminal referrals against 2 Meridian executives directly involved in coordinating fraudulent HOA schemes across multiple counties.
Alongside civil penalties, the State Consumer Protection Agency pursued against the company itself for predatory business practices targeting vulnerable, unsuspecting homeowners throughout several distinct residential communities regionally.
Brett Sanderson, notably, was among those referred for potential criminal charges related directly to his documented communications with Karen regarding my family specifically. Patricia mentioned, almost gleefully, that his earlier claim of corporate ignorance during our final phone call would likely feature prominently as evidence of consciousness of guilt during any eventual prosecution proceedings against him personally. Watching this entire scheme unravel far beyond anything I'd originally imagined when Karen first handed me that absurd $100,000 fine, I found myself reflecting often on Grandpa Frank, wondering what he'd think seeing his quiet, decades-old insistence on protecting water rights ultimately exposed not just one corrupt HOA president, but an entire regional pattern of coordinated fraud. Sarah suggested, half joking but clearly somewhat serious, that we should frame the original 1962 deed and hang it prominently in our living room, a permanent reminder of exactly how much protection one stubborn old man's paperwork had ultimately provided decades after his own passing. I agreed immediately, already planning where the frame might eventually hang. As the Meridian investigation continued expanding, Detective Ruiz called with news that shifted everything again. Karen, apparently hoping to negotiate reduced restitution obligations given her now limited prison-based earning capacity, had offered full cooperation regarding Meridian's broader scheme in exchange for consideration during an upcoming parole eligibility review scheduled years down the road. Her cooperation, once formalized through her attorney, revealed the full scope of her arrangement with Meridian, a promised $150,000 personal payment upon successful facilitation of the HOA's eventual sale of consolidated lakefront parcels, payable only once all problem homeowners, myself specifically named among them, had either sold voluntarily or been otherwise legally removed from their properties. Reading that specific dollar figure, $150,000, promised specifically for successfully removing my family from our own land, produced a strange, visceral anger even after everything already uncovered throughout this entire ordeal. This wasn't abstract institutional overreach anymore. This was a specific, calculated bounty placed on displacing my daughter from the lake where she'd learned to fish. Sarah, reading the same cooperation agreement details that evening, went quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. She would have kept going, she said slowly. Fine after fine, complaint after complaint, until we either gave up or ran out of money to fight back. That $150,000 was never about community values. It was simply the price on our home. Patricia confirmed that Karen's formal cooperation agreement, now filed as part of the ongoing Meridian investigation, would be admissible evidence supporting significantly enhanced civil damages against both Karen personally and Meridian directly, given the clear, documented, premeditated intent to specifically target and financially exhaust my family until we abandoned property my grandfather had specifically protected decades earlier. I called Richard immediately upon learning these details, needing to process the full weight of what we'd actually survived. He listened quietly before responding. You know what saved you? He said finally. Not just the deed. It was refusing to fold the very first time she smiled at you with that clipboard. Most people fold immediately. That observation stuck with me for days afterward. How many other families, across however many neighborhoods Meridian and their coordinating HOA presidents had targeted, simply sold quietly, exhausted and afraid, never realizing they'd been deliberately, systematically pressured out of homes they'd otherwise never willingly left? Our stubbornness, turned out, had accidentally exposed something much larger. Detective Ruiz mentioned that at least 4 other families across the previously identified affected neighborhoods had, in fact, already sold their properties to Meridian under similarly manufactured pressure over recent years. Properties now formally flagged as potential subjects for separate civil recovery actions given the newly established pattern of coordinated, premeditated fraud targeting specific homeowners. Patricia began exploring, alongside attorneys representing those other affected families, whether previously completed property sales might be legally challenged and potentially reversed given clear evidence the sales resulted directly from coordinated fraudulent pressure rather than genuine, voluntary market decisions. Felt, increasingly, like uncovering layers of an operation far larger than any of us initially imagined. I found myself thinking often about those other families during this period. People I'd never met, scattered across neighborhoods I'd never visited, who'd simply given up their homes believing they faced ordinary, if unfair, HOA enforcement rather than a coordinated scheme specifically designed to displace them for corporate profit. Our small fishing dispute had apparently uncovered something genuinely significant. Sarah and I discussed, at length, whether we felt any complicated satisfaction watching Karen's cooperation deal potentially help other victims we'd never personally met. "I think Grandpa Frank would be proud either way," Sarah said eventually. "Not because we exposed a scheme, but because we simply refused to let someone bully us out of something that mattered." Emily, still largely shielded from these deeper, more troubling revelations about the coordinated scheme's true scale, remained blissfully focused on ordinary childhood concerns, an upcoming school science fair, whether her friend Madison could join our next fishing trip, and whether the bluegill population in Miller's Pond had grown large enough to support an actual fishing tournament someday. I promised her we'd discuss a small, informal neighborhood fishing tournament with Richard once things settled further, privately finding comfort in how completely her world had returned to appropriately small, age-appropriate concerns after months of unavoidable exposure to adult conflict she'd never asked for or deserved throughout this entire prolonged, complicated ordeal. Karen's cooperation agreement, once fully processed by prosecutors, resulted in modestly reduced restitution obligations in exchange for testimony against Meridian executives, though her existing 4-year prison sentence remained entirely unchanged given the severity and premeditation clearly established throughout her documented targeting of specific families, myself included, for calculated financial and psychological exhaustion. Patricia mentioned, almost as an aside during one of our regular case update calls, that Karen's cooperation had specifically included handing over recorded phone conversations with Brett Sanderson from months earlier, conversations Karen had apparently kept as personal insurance, anticipating correctly that Meridian might eventually abandon her once her own fraud became publicly exposed and legally inconvenient for their operations. That detail, oddly, humanized Karen slightly in my mind for the first time throughout this entire saga. Not sympathetically exactly, but understandably. She'd been played by Meridian just as thoroughly as she'd played her own neighbors, promised a payout she likely never actually received once her usefulness ended and her legal exposure became a liability the company preferred distancing themselves from entirely. Sarah pointed out, when I mentioned this observation, that understanding Karen's own manipulation by Meridian didn't erase her culpability toward us, Gloria, the Whitakers, or anyone else she'd personally harmed throughout years of unchecked HOA authority. She chose to be the instrument, Sarah said firmly, even if someone else eventually used that instrument against her too. I agreed entirely, recognizing that context explained behavior without excusing consequences. Karen had made every individual choice herself, fabricating the notarization date, diverting HOA funds, specifically naming my family in emails as an obstacle requiring removal. Whatever Meridian's own broader manipulation, Karen alone had decided, repeatedly, to execute their scheme against her own trusting neighbors. As the combined criminal and civil proceedings against Meridian executives began moving toward eventual resolution, Patricia estimated our family's total recoverable damages, now including the enhanced civil claims, related to documented premeditated targeting, could potentially reach $475,000 once combined with our earlier settlement, restitution payments, and additional damages from the expanded Meridian-related litigation. That number, once theoretical, now felt increasingly tangible given the overwhelming documented evidence accumulated throughout this entire prolonged ordeal: the deed, the fake notarization, Ms. Chen's forensic audit, Karen's own incriminating emails, and now her formal cooperation testimony directly implicating Meridian's coordinated targeting scheme across multiple regional neighborhoods and affected families. Sarah and I discussed, carefully, what this eventual settlement might mean practically for our family beyond simple vindication. Emily's future college fund, perhaps. Long postponed home improvements beyond just the dock. Maybe, we joked somewhat seriously, finally taking that extended family fishing trip to Montana Grandpa Frank had always talked about but never quite managed himself before passing. Richard mentioned, during one of our regular coffee meetings, that the broader Meridian investigation had attracted attention from state legislators, considering new consumer protection laws specifically addressing coordinated HOA fraud schemes connected to predatory real estate development practices. Our small neighborhood dispute, entirely unexpectedly, was potentially reshaping regional policy protecting future homeowners from similar coordinated targeting schemes. I found this particular development genuinely moving in ways the financial settlements, however significant, somehow didn't quite match. Grandpa Frank's simple, stubborn insistence on protecting our family's water rights had ultimately contributed to protecting countless future families from experiencing anything similar to what Gloria, the Whitakers, and my own family had endured throughout this entire year-long ordeal. Patricia mentioned that proposed legislation, informally nicknamed by legislative staffers as the Reyes-Whitfield Act, given our case's prominent role in exposing the broader scheme, would require mandatory independent financial audits for all state HOAs biennially, alongside explicit legal protections preventing associations from levying disproportionate fines exceeding reasonable percentages of assessed property value under any circumstances. That legislative recognition felt strange to process. Our family's name informally attached to policy reform alongside Karen's, forever linking our fishing dispute with her fraud in official record. Sarah joked that Emily's future grandchildren might someday learn about the Reyes-Whitfield Act in some civics class, entirely unaware it originated from her grandmother's childhood fishing trips being interrupted. Emily, when we eventually explained a simplified version of this legislative development, seemed genuinely proud rather than confused. So now other kids won't lose their fishing spots because of mean grown-ups? She asked. I told her that was exactly right. Watching her process this concept with the straightforward moral clarity only children seem to genuinely maintain consistently. As autumn deepened toward winter, the combined legal proceedings against Karen, Meridian, and its implicated executives began reaching their various formal conclusions. Karen's sentence remained unchanged despite her cooperation. Meridian faced substantial civil penalties from the State Consumer Protection Agency. Brett Sanderson and one additional executive received formal criminal charges for coordinated fraud. The broader class action representing affected families across multiple neighborhoods eventually reached a combined settlement exceeding $4.2 million distributed among dozens of documented victims throughout the region.
Funded primarily through Meridian's corporate assets and remaining recoverable funds from Karen's own limited, largely already seized personal estate following the earlier successful fraudulent conveyance challenges.
Our family's specific portion. Once all combined settlements, restitution payments, and civil damages were finally calculated and processed through the courts, totaled just over $410,000, considerably more than the absurd $100,000 fine that had started this entire ordeal, yet somehow still feeling secondary to simply reclaiming Emily's uninterrupted Saturday mornings at the lake. Sarah and I sat down together one quiet evening to discuss practically how we wanted to use this settlement, agreeing quickly on priorities: a meaningful contribution toward Emily's future education, completing several postponed home improvements, and setting aside a modest reserve specifically earmarked for any future legal challenges, though we both sincerely hoped we'd never need it again. Richard, still serving faithfully as HOA president through this entire recovery period, proposed using a small portion of the association's recovered funds to establish an annual Founders' Day celebration, honoring residents like Grandpa Frank, whose original land agreements had protected the community's integrity long before anyone understood exactly how necessary that protection would eventually prove. The community, overwhelmingly, supported Richard's proposal enthusiastically, voting unanimously at the next regular meeting to establish the celebration permanently, complete with a small community fishing tournament held annually at Miller's Pond specifically, open to all resident families regardless of formal HOA amenity classifications that had once, briefly, threatened to restrict access entirely. Emily, upon learning about the planned annual fishing tournament, immediately began strategizing about lure selection and optimal casting positions with the intense seriousness only a 9-year-old could bring to competitive backyard fishing. Sarah and I exchanged amused glances, grateful beyond words that her biggest current concern involved fishing tournament strategy rather than adult legal proceedings. That gratitude, more than any settlement figure or legislative recognition, represented what actually mattered most throughout this entire prolonged ordeal. We'd successfully protected not just our land, our finances, or even our reputation, but something considerably more fragile and important, our daughter's fundamental sense that fairness eventually, reliably prevails even against seemingly unstoppable institutional power. As winter finally settled over Whispering Pines, bringing its usual quiet, frost-covered mornings unsuitable for fishing, our family found ourselves reflecting often on everything the preceding year had cost and ultimately restored. Karen remained in state prison, her fraud fully exposed and permanently documented. Meridian faced ongoing regulatory consequences reshaping how developers approached similar future schemes. Gloria's roof stood newly repaired against the coming winter weather. The Whitaker's Daughters College Fund grew steadily alongside their continued residency in a neighborhood that finally, genuinely felt like home rather than a place requiring constant vigilance against arbitrary institutional overreach. Richard's proposed bylaws reforms had quietly transformed Whispering Pines into something considerably fairer for everyone. One particularly cold December morning, Detective Ruiz called with what she described as final, closing case updates before formally transferring remaining oversight responsibilities to the State Consumer Protection Agency handling Meridian's ongoing regulatory penalties. Almost as an afterthought, she mentioned something that immediately caught my full, undivided attention despite the otherwise routine nature of the call. During final asset recovery efforts targeting Karen's remaining estate, investigators had discovered a previously unknown safe deposit box registered under her maiden name, Karen Doyle, containing additional documents seemingly related to her activities predating even her HOA presidency. Records suggesting she'd operated remarkably similar schemes at a previous residence years before ever moving to Whispering Pines. That revelation landed with genuine shock despite everything already uncovered. Karen hadn't simply discovered this particular fraudulent opportunity upon becoming HOA president locally. She'd apparently practiced, refined, and perfected these exact same manipulative tactics somewhere else entirely first, treating our entire neighborhood as merely her second, more ambitious iteration of an already established, deliberately calculated criminal pattern. Detective Ruiz explained that these newly discovered records pointed toward a previous HOA in a different county, roughly 8 years earlier, where Karen, then still using her maiden name professionally in some capacity, had apparently served briefly as a board treasurer before abruptly relocating following unexplained, never formally investigated financial irregularities that residents there had simply attributed to poor bookkeeping. This meant Karen's arrival in Whispering Pines hadn't been coincidental opportunity discovered gradually over years of gradually increasing local authority. It had been, apparently, a calculated relocation specifically enabling a second attempt at the same fundamental scheme, this time refined, expanded, and eventually connected to Meridian's much larger coordinated regional development fraud operation entirely. Patricia, upon hearing this update, immediately began exploring whether residents from that previous county might have valid, if significantly delayed, civil claims against Karen for similar undocumented fraud from years earlier, assuming sufficient evidence and documentation still existed to support such claims despite the considerable passage of time since Karen's earlier alleged activities occurred there. I found myself oddly unsurprised by this revelation despite its genuine shock value, having spent nearly a year watching Karen operate with a level of calculated precision that never once felt like improvised opportunism. Fabricating notarization dates, establishing shell LLCs, coordinating with predatory developers, these weren't the actions of someone discovering fraud accidentally through gradual moral erosion. Sarah agreed entirely when I shared the update that evening, adding her own observation. She probably thought she'd learned from whatever mistakes happened last time, she said thoughtfully. Better shell company name, more careful paperwork, actual developer partnership instead of acting alone. She just didn't count on someone actually having a real deed protecting real water rights. That observation struck me as particularly accurate, reflecting on everything we'd uncovered throughout this entire prolonged ordeal. Karen's carefully refined second attempt had ultimately failed not because of any particular investigative brilliance on our part, but because Grandpa Frank, decades earlier, had simply insisted on protecting something specific through proper legal documentation nobody could later dispute or manipulate. Detective Ruiz mentioned this new evidence regarding Karen's previous alleged fraud would likely be considered during any future parole eligibility review, potentially extending her actual served time significantly beyond the original 4-year sentence if formally investigated and proven as an established pattern of repeated, premeditated criminal behavior across multiple separate residential communities over several years. I passed this information along to Gloria and the Whitakers during our next informal neighborhood gathering, watching their expressions shift from shock into something resembling grim satisfaction. So this wasn't even her first rodeo, Gloria said slowly, shaking her head. She really thought she could just keep doing this forever, moving on whenever things got uncomfortable. Richard, upon hearing the update, mentioned he intended to formally recommend Whispering Pines' revised bylaws specifically require thorough background verification for any future board president candidates, including contact with any previous HOA communities where prospective candidates had served, a provision he wryly suggested nicknaming the Karen Clause among the neighborhood's ongoing governance reforms. That suggestion, half-joking as it was initially offered, actually passed formally at the next community meeting, residents overwhelmingly supporting additional verification requirements given everything Whispering Pines had collectively endured and ultimately overcome throughout this entire extended ordeal spanning fraud, forgery, coordinated corporate targeting, and finally, genuine, hard-earned institutional and legal accountability. As winter progressed toward the approaching holiday season, our family found ourselves settling into something resembling genuine normalcy for the first time in over a year. Emily's school performance improved noticeably, her therapist noting significantly reduced anxiety markers during routine follow-up appointments. Sarah returned to her usual optimistic disposition, no longer performing constant mental math regarding compounding fines. I found myself, personally, sleeping through entire nights again without replaying old HOA meetings or deed clauses in my head. A small but genuinely significant improvement I hadn't fully appreciated until it actually returned. Grandpa Frank's old filing cabinet, once a source of desperate late-night searching, now sat quietly reorganized, its contents properly archived and permanently protected. We decided, as a family, to properly frame not just the original 1962 deed as Sarah had earlier suggested, but also a printed copy of the recent regional news article featuring Emily's own simple, honest statement about getting her fishing spot back. Together, framed side by side, they told a complete story spanning generations, protecting something worth genuinely fighting for. Richard invited our family personally to help plan the inaugural Founders' Day celebration scheduled for the following spring. An honor I accepted readily given everything the community had collectively endured together throughout this ordeal. Planning discussions felt refreshingly ordinary after months of lawyers, forensic auditors, and criminal investigators dominating nearly every conversation about our neighborhood. Emily, increasingly confident and resilient following everything her family had navigated successfully, asked if she could help design promotional flyers for the upcoming fishing tournament portion of Founders' Day, spending an entire weekend afternoon carefully drawing fish, lake waves, and a proud declaration reading "Everyone welcome" across the top in her own careful 9-year-old handwriting. That simple phrase, "Everyone welcome," struck me as perhaps the most complete possible rebuke to everything Karen had represented throughout her entire tenure as HOA president. Exclusion, manipulation, calculated targeting of specific families for elimination. My daughter's simple flyer, entirely unintentionally, articulated exactly the values our neighborhood had fought so hard to genuinely reclaim. Sarah suggested we hang Emily's flyer prominently in the clubhouse where community meetings once felt tense and adversarial under Karen's controlling presidency. Richard agreed enthusiastically, and within days, Emily's careful crayon drawing occupied a place of honor near the entrance, welcoming residents into a space finally, genuinely reflecting fairness rather than fear. As the one-year anniversary of receiving that absurd $100,000 fine approached, I found myself reflecting on everything that single, laughably excessive piece of paper had ultimately set into motion: a fraud exposed, a predatory developer scheme uncovered, legislative reform proposed, and countless previously silent, intimidated neighbors finally, collectively finding their voice. Patricia called around this same time with final confirmation that all combined settlements, restitution payments, and civil damages had been fully processed and deposited into our family's accounts, formally closing our specific portion of this now extensive, multi-layered legal saga that had somehow grown from one fishing dispute into genuine regional consumer protection reform. I thanked Patricia sincerely for her tireless work throughout this entire ordeal, acknowledging that without her early recognition of that suspicious notarization date discrepancy, this might have remained simply an unresolved property dispute rather than the comprehensive exposure of coordinated fraud it ultimately became. She modestly credited Grandpa Frank's original careful paperwork as the true foundation. "You had the evidence from the very beginning," she reminded me during that final call. "Most people never even check their own deeds carefully enough to know what protections they actually have. Your grandfather did the hard work decades ago. You just had to be stubborn enough to actually use it when someone finally tried taking it away." That final observation stayed with me for days afterward. A reminder that this entire saga's true beginning wasn't Karen's clipboard, her fabricated clause, or even my own months of gathering evidence. It began decades earlier with one quiet, stubborn man insisting on protecting something he valued, trusting that paperwork, properly filed, could outlast even the most determined future attempt to erase it. Spring eventually arrived, bringing with it the inaugural Founders' Day celebration Richard had proposed months earlier. Whispering pines gathered at Miller's Pond in genuine, uncomplicated community, families setting up folding chairs and picnic blankets along the same shoreline that had once sat blocked behind a padlocked gate under false, fraudulent HOA authority claims. Emily, thrilled beyond measure, participated enthusiastically in the neighborhood's first official fishing tournament, ultimately placing third among the children's division despite fierce competition from her friend Madison and several other neighborhood kids equally eager for bragging rights over the community's now beloved, formerly contested lake and its resident bluegill population. Gloria brought her famous lemon bars, insisting everyone try at least one slice while sharing updates about her newly repaired roof surviving its first winter beautifully. The Whitakers proudly announced their daughter's recent college acceptance, crediting their settlement's contribution toward tuition costs they'd once worried might remain permanently out of reach given years of unjust fines. Richard, addressing the gathered community briefly before the tournament's official prize ceremony, spoke simply about resilience, community, and the importance of never allowing unchecked institutional authority to go entirely unquestioned, regardless of how intimidating or seemingly absolute that authority might initially appear to ordinary families simply wanting peace in their own neighborhood. I watched Emily proudly display her third-place ribbon to anyone willing to admire it, remembering vividly the tear-filled morning nearly a year earlier when her tackle box sat untouched on our kitchen counter. Saturday mornings suddenly, unfairly stolen by someone who'd mistaken volunteer authority for genuine, unchecked power over other people's lives and property. Standing at the water's edge that afternoon, surrounded by neighbors who'd become genuine friends through shared adversity, I thought about Grandpa Frank often throughout that celebration, wishing he could have witnessed how thoroughly his quiet, stubborn insistence on protecting this exact water had ultimately safeguarded not just our family, but an entire community's fundamental sense of fairness and belonging. Karen Whitfield remained in state prison that spring, her name now permanently associated with fraud, forgery, and coordinated corporate targeting rather than any position of community authority. Meridian faced ongoing regulatory consequences reshaping industry practices statewide. And at Miller's Pond, Emily cast her line again beneath clear spring sunlight, exactly where she'd always belonged, fishing freely on her own family's land. That evening, driving home from Founder's Day with Emily's ribbon proudly displayed on our dashboard and Sarah humming quietly beside me, I finally understood something Grandpa Frank had probably known all along, that some fights aren't really about lakes, fines, or even fairness alone. They're about refusing to let anyone convince you that giving up is easier than standing your ground. The END